So what we're going to do is talk through the impact of probably the two scariest letters when it comes to thinking about your workforce and transformation. There's AI, but specifically the impact of these new tools on your workforce. And we're going to have a look at some of the sort of common challenges and business challenges that organizations face when it comes to taking on this type of change. And we're also going to then talk more practically about things that you can do to address those challenges, as well as how technology can sort of help go on that type of journey. But before we get started, I always like to start off with feeling out a bit of where the audience is when it comes to this type of thing. So we'll just do sort of two quick show of hands. So first, hands up if you are currently thinking about how AI will affect your workforce broadly. Okay, a lot of hands up. Awesome. Who of you all has active projects that are going to be affecting how AI is adopted within your organization? Okay, that could be anything from introducing new tools, upskilling individuals to take advantage of these new technologies, changing processes that are going to use these tools as well. So it looks like we're all sort of aware that this is a real big impact. And we know that this sort of change is here. We've been seeing a massive adoption of some of these new technologies, specifically thanks to large language models being popularized by OpenAI, but then other tools coming out more recently like Bard with Google or Copilot with Microsoft, and a bunch of other more vertical and tailored solutions for different use cases. What we're seeing is a bit of a change in the way that we've thought about automation in organizations. Traditionally, things have been focused more on what we might call robotics, thinking about how we can use technology to automate, say, physical types of work. But with this new change, we're thinking about how more knowledge workers may be affected thanks to some of these automations using tools like AI. And that's led to a bunch of different research. So here's a few stats from Goldman Sachs, who found that roughly about 2/3 of jobs today may be impacted by the introduction of some of these new technologies. But what's really interesting is that about 25% of the tasks that people do today are those that are at risk of automation. So there's a bit of a discrepancy there, and we'll dig into this in a bit more detail. But what this tells us is that even though a large number of roles and a large proportion of the workforce are going to be affected in some way, it's actually more likely that small portions of people's roles, their day-to-day, are going to be affected. And what we need to do is identify where that 25% is, and then build a workforce that is resilient in face of that change. And the other thing we'll call out here is that this change does affect a broad part of the organization. It's not just one role or one area or one set of teams. It's affecting a large range of different areas. So everything from office and admin to legal. And obviously some areas will be affected more than others, but we're seeing this as a transformational change across a broad range of your organizations. And that's good news, and it may have some consequences. It's great for those organizations that are adept at adapting and can change very quickly in response to these types of shifts in technology. Those who do will see an uptick in productivity, uptick in economic output. But on the other side of that, we might see that there's certain organizations that are potentially left behind if they can't adapt quickly when thinking about performance against their competitors. So we're going to talk through different approaches, different methods you can use to actually try and address some of that so you can be more proactive when it comes to managing some of this change. And here's 4 examples. This not as neat as it's laid out on a pretty PowerPoint slide here, but these are 4 areas that we can sort of dig into. 2 on the right-hand side here are more focused on analysis and getting an understanding of sort of where to focus. And the 2 on the left are more focused on how you take action using some insights, whether it's doing some organizational modeling or looking at skills and potentially reskilling a workforce. But we'll start with some benchmarking. So there's a bunch of different ways we can very quickly get an understanding of the impact of AI on your workforce. There's a load of different benchmarks that are available. Some are free to use, open source almost. Others are proprietary and can be sourced from vendors. Some focus more on roles, others focus on skills or industry, but there's a lot of information that can give you a very quick insight into what the impact of automation is on your workforce. Now, the trade-off with speed is often accuracy. We know that we might be able to get to insight very quickly, but a software engineer at, say, Lyondell is going to be very different from a software engineer at, say, Southwest Airlines, potentially, which may, again, be quite different from a role defined in a generic benchmark. But when we need to go a bit further and into a bit more detail, what we can do is look at individual tasks and work. And we'll go into this in a bit more detail shortly, but this is the way we actually look at the individual things that people are doing in your organization, and then seeing of the work that's done, what is a higher or lower risk of being automated using some of these different tools and technologies. Then when it comes to thinking about implementing some of the change, we might look at doing some organizational modeling. We know which roles might be needed more in the future. We know which roles maybe we need fewer of. And then we can build out team structures that can account for that type of change and build out the different operating models aligned to different processes and technologies that those teams might be using. And thinking most about the sort of employee experience, we might go to the skills gap and have a look at the different skills that we need in the workforce today, what might be less prevalent tomorrow, and then how do we adapt our workforce through reskilling and upskilling programs to make sure that we have a resilient workforce in the future. The only final thing to call out here is that none of these areas are sort of prerequisites or dependent on one another. They might be complementary in certain areas, but we find that some people are just focused on using external benchmarks, identifying where there's risk and opportunity, and then using that as a jumping off point to then make change. Others have other initiatives within their organizations that means that they'll just go straight into modeling out changes on their workforce through doing some modeling or some role design. But we're going to talk through a few of these different examples today to give you an understanding of the types of things that other people are doing when it comes to preparing for this type of change and impact on your workforce. But before all of that, there's a few sort of things that we need to keep in mind. These sort of guiding principles, I like to call them. So one of them is around data and making sure that you've got the right types of data to make the right types of decision. We know that data is messy. It sets in all sorts of different places. It's never going to be 100% accurate, but we need to consolidate all of that, get as good a version of the truth as we can to then make better informed decisions. And ideally, keep that data up to date, so then we're working off of the latest and greatest. The second is knowing what the impact is. And when it comes to thinking about AI and automation, that might be thinking about what might be going away or coming in the future. But these same concepts apply to any type of transformational change, as Mike was mentioning. And the third is, how do you build a sort of proactive capability around adapting to all sorts of different change? A few years ago, this was used in, say, thinking about the pandemic and a more remote workforce. Since then, we've been talking more about global location strategy with a lot of customers. And now the latest iteration of this happens to be artificial intelligence and some of these other tools that may be able to automate different types of work. But by keeping these sort of guiding principles in mind, we've got the framework and the tool set to then adapt to the next change, which may be coming in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But we're going to get a bit more specific now and start to think about how OrgView actually helps customers go through these types of changes. And there's a rapid assessment where you can use some of these benchmarks we've been talking about to very quickly get a handle on where your organization sits in terms of automation impact. And we're talking a number of days, not weeks or months. We can then go deeper in different types of analysis to have a look at the activities that we were talking about a moment ago, or even the skills that people have in the workforce today. And then all of that, it really is in service to driving some type of change, whether that's designing a future state organization with the required roles in place, whether it's thinking about talent and getting the right people into those roles, or if it's thinking more about the types of roles that you need more generally in the future, building out things like job architectures with some of these other skill sets and future state requirements in mind. So these are sort of the three areas that we can dig into. But for today, we're going to focus on really that rapid assessment and the detailed analysis around activities specifically. So let's dig into that in a bit more detail. So what does it look like in practice? We'll start off with a rapid assessment. So this is how you can plug your organization into available benchmarks to then understand what the impact is going to be. And then we'll go into a more detailed analysis. But we're going to start a bit with the end in mind. So here's a bit of a heat map on one side showing a current organization and a high, medium, low potential impact score. And on the other side, we're having a look at a bit of a summary of which areas of the organization are most impacted. So what we've done is take some externally available benchmarks, overlay them into our organization, and very quickly get to this level of insight of seeing where there's higher risk or lower risk. And over on the right-hand side, we can just call out a couple examples. We can see that, say, 18 roles in my consulting and services department are likely to be a higher risk for automation than some of the others in other departments. But this is a type of insight we can get to very quickly by plugging into different types of benchmarks. So we've mentioned benchmarks a few times, and there's a bunch of different examples of these. Here's one that was developed by the Department of Labor here in the US, where they've categorized all these different roles, and there's all sorts of different types of information associated with them. Things like expected headcount now and in the future, expected educational background, maybe there's some compensation information in there as well. But what we're interested in is thinking about what they call the automation score, which is what proportion of this role might be automated in the future. And there's all sorts of different analysis that feeds into this, and they've got a whole sort of piece on their website. So if you want to learn more, feel free to reach out after this and we can sort of share some of this with you. But what we're able to do is take some of these widely available benchmarks, or other vendors have things that are maybe a bit more specific to your industry or the areas of the world that you work in. And we're able to take these and overlay them into your own organization to, again, very quickly get to this type of understanding of where is there the biggest risk and how do we start to plan for that effectively. And here's just sort of one example of how we can map that in, where we've got, say, different roles in our organization again, and we're just mapping them across into a benchmark, using some of those predefined roles that have been defined by some of these different organizations. And then using these, we can then see, based on the classifications that have been provided, where the largest areas of impact are. And then this might be where we decide to go and focus on in more detail. Now, for some customers, this might be the end. We might just use this as a jumping off point to actually start driving some organizational change. Others might want to go into this in a bit more detail, and that's where that second pillar, that more detailed assessment comes in, which is what we're going to have a look at next. So we'll go into a more detailed assessment where we're going beyond just looking at a generic benchmark and overlaying that against our organization very quickly. And we're going to do something that is maybe a bit more rigorous, where we're actually looking at activities and the work that people are doing in your organization, and then seeing how they can adapt in the future and change based on some of these new technologies. So we've got a summary here of all of the activities, all of the work that may be being done within an organization. There's taxonomies for things like this. We have sort of frameworks that we can sort of work it with as a starting point. And if you're interested in how we actually get to this level of information, where we can see the number of people who are involved with different tasks, the number of different roles that are associated with them, and the cost of individual tasks as well, we can dig into that in a bit more detail, maybe after this session. If you're interested in learning more, feel free to grab me or Mike in the lobby here. But where this becomes relevant is that we know how our organization is working right now. And we know that there's certain elements of this work which may be being automated in the future. So we can use this as a basis to understand which roles and which people in our organization might be affected as we start to introduce some of these other technologies. And we're going to actually go into a bit more detail here and classify certain things to understand where that biggest automation potential is. And there's all sorts of different frameworks you can use. In this case, what we've done is classify things into, is this a physical or mental activity? Is this a repetitive or variable task? Is this interactive or independent? And based on some of those classifications, we can then maybe identify what type of automation might apply to this specific task. There are certain things that may be a better candidate for an outsourcing initiative or using a global workforce, while others might be focused on more of the AI impact. And that's what we'll focus on for today, where we can see if something is mental, repetitive, and say independent, that is a candidate for something that could potentially be augmented with AI or some of these other automation tools. Then we can layer on all sorts of different assumptions. Okay, once we know that these are the candidates, what is the potential cost saving of introducing some type of automation? What's the potential headcount saving that we could potentially see? And on the other side of that, there's also going to be some net increases in other areas. There's what we call sort of unknown unknowns, where as new technologies are introduced, there's new activities and roles that maybe need to come about to support those. When it comes to AI specifically, something that we haven't seen before 18 months ago is the whole concept of prompt engineering. This is a whole new skill set, a whole new domain. Entire roles and job descriptions are being built around this new thing that didn't exist recently, and we're just at the very start of seeing these types of trends sort of unfold further. But what we've done here is map out different activities, seeing what the impacts of those are in terms of automation. And we're going to overlay that against our existing workforce by keeping in mind all of the things that people are doing today when it comes to the proportion of time that they're spending on those tasks that we were just looking at. And we can see, okay, what is all of the things that, say, Michael, my Chief Revenue Officer, is involved with on a regular basis? That's within one area, that's within my sales organization. Now, there's going to be other roles that we might want to investigate further and say, okay, just get a baseline on who's involved with which tasks today. And then we're going to overlay the assumptions to say, what if we automated this by X% or that or Y%? And how is that going to affect, say, my head of sales operations, who might be in a role that is more affected by some of these things than some of the others? And we can see where there's certain things that are going to be increasing thanks to some of these technologies, but there's other areas that might be being decreased as well. And we can bring all of those different assumptions together to then see, here's the net impact, here's my current state, here's my future state, here's my current sort of as is FTE, my future state FTE, if we apply all of these potential automations to this one role or to those activities, here's the impact on that one role, and here's the impact for Teresa, who's in that role currently. And that goes for all sorts of different types of change. AI and automation is the one that we've been talking about now. But as we mentioned, this could apply to any type of change that's going to affect how your organization operates and the people and the way that they work sort of with each other. And we can bring all of this information together to then see, based on all of the assumptions that we tie to individual activities and the way that we expect them to change in the future, what is the net impact for a given role? We can see that there might be certain things that we mentioned, might be no longer needed as much in the future. There might be other things that we're going to need a lot more of as well. And we can get all of these things together to then build out a future state organization that keeps in mind the current state of the workforce, but then also gives you a transition plan into a future state. And that's where that third pillar that we were talking about a moment ago comes in, which is that design and implement. So that's a bit of an overview of how different organizations are thinking about preparing for AI more practically. We started off with some context, some overall, what is the magnitude of change that we can expect. And then we went into a bit more detail on specific methods that you can use to address those changes, whether it's looking at getting insight very quickly using benchmarks and readily available data, or if it's doing more internal benchmarking, going deep in your own organization. But all of that is in service to driving some type of change in your workforce.